Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, September 26th, where we are talking about Dracula, which is considered to be the first American horror film. Though, of course, as you know from last class, we talked about Dr. Caligari, or the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, as being considered the first feature-length horror film, that being a German film. So not only is it an example of horror film, but it's also an example of the cinematic movement of German expressionism that you might know from a film that is related to Dracula, Nosferatu, that we will be talking about soon. So, as you know, I had asked you to talk about the story frame about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, though there are many other ways to examine the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And as you know, there is going to be a final project at the ending of the semester that we'll be talking about further as the semester progresses. And perhaps you might want to do your project on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. You've all submitted in journals on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and I am in the midst of returning those back to you. And as you know, the journals are just an informal response of about a page or so, but as long or as short as you need it to be, in terms of the film and how it fulfills some of the cinematic conventions that we've been talking about for horror film. And I'm grading it informally, not for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. So a plus would be an excellent grade, and check plus would be a very good. So there's room for improvement, and a check is satisfactory. And most of the grades usually end up there, although there is a less than satisfactory and an unsatisfactory. And now that we've begun watching the films, you'll basically have a journal due every week. So your next journal, journal number 2, will be on Dracula. Same sort of idea as what you did with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And you have 48 hours from this class to submit in your journal, much like you have 48 hours from this posted class to submit in your attendance form response. But of course, if you need additional time, please let me know, and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. And while you're not necessarily required to respond to your peers' discussion forum posts, you're certainly encouraged to. Think of it as a kind of class situation where you might raise your hand and respond to someone's comment. You are required, however, to read all of your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. It'll give you an idea of what we would have talked about in a face-to-face class during a class discussion. So, in terms of Dracula, I guess this goes to the idea of history. You might know Dracul, son of the devil, is what that means literally. Cruel Romanian emperor and conqueror, I should say. And Vlad the Impaler, probably being very, very famous, that helped to inspire Dracula, the son of Vlad Dracul. And you can see in the notes below in the second section that I've got some woodcuts and also some images that you might want to take a look at. Reputedly, Vlad the Impaler was so evil and so cruel that he would stake his victims around him, their beheaded heads, on stakes and swords, and basically would eat surrounded by that kind of carnage. Probably one of the smartest things that Bram Stoker could have done was to take the vampire myth and call our main vampire Dracula. And Dracula is actually related in part too to another famous horror film and Gothic text, Frankenstein. The way that Frankenstein was created in the 1800s as a Gothic novel is that Mary Shelley, the author, and Percy Shelley, her spouse, and some of their friends were vacationing and had inclement weather, so they decided to challenge themselves to write a ghost story competition. And that's where the famous Frankenstein came from. Mary Shelley had a dream about the famous creation scene that you might know from Frankenstein, and she turned that into the novel. But that evening, one of their friends, a Dr. Polidori, came up with a short story entitled The Vampire. And it's thought that this short story, The Vampire, along with some of the history associated with Dracul and Vlad the Impaler, led to Bram Stoker creating the iconic Dracula, which first appeared as a Broadway stage play, and some of the conventions associated with the film version of Dracula are associated with that stage play. So, for instance, the collar on the cape, it was a stage convention to hide the actor actually moving into a trap door beneath him as he would be playing the vampire who would disappear into thin air. And in terms of thinking about the first film version of Dracula, that was actually a bootleg version, and that's Nosferatu. And Dracula's, or I should say, Bram Stoker's widow, tried her hardest to destroy all of the prints of Nosferatu because she was never, and Stoker's estate were never compensated properly for the use of that story. Luckily for us, she was unsuccessful. So Nosferatu is a great example of German expressionism, and you can see that in the first section of the notes that I have, how it was first adapted to screen in 1921, Nosferatu. Um, so that helped to inspire ultimately the very famous version of Dracula that stars Bela Lugosi. And this would be the 1930s. If you think about the 1930s, a time of great economic turmoil, the Great Depression. So film was seen as an opportunity for escapism. However, politically, it was also a time of great tension. There's European fascism, there's Eastern communism, there's anti Semitism, there's the new women's vote, and all of the anxieties about the power of female, something that we will revisit when we talk about the 1940s with cat people. And eugenics, the selective breeding of desirable traits, in order to be able to, in theory, strengthen the populace. So you've got all of this tension going on, and the director, Todd Browning, who's known as the father of the American horror film, and who believed that most people are morbid, by the way, creates Dracula. And that film in 1931 is listed in the Library of Congress, U.S. National Film Registry, as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant, which is something that we will be focusing on for our attendance question, because I'm going to ask you if you agree or disagree with that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Originally, it had no musical score, so it depends on the version of Dracula that you're seeing. That said, I was able to find a free link for Dracula. As you know, whenever I can find free links, I will provide them to you. If you find better links, certainly provide them to me so that I can provide them to the class. We might get to the point, just because of copyright, that I won't be able to provide you with free links, but I will certainly try my best. And we're still in the early days of talkies, so that I think you see a lot of the conventions of silent film with Dracula, a lot of the overacting, for instance, that we oftentimes associate with silent film. The story of Bela Lugosi being cast as Dracula, and he's become the iconic version of Dracula, is also interesting because Bela Lugosi was not fluent in English, so he learned his role phonetically. It's one of the reasons for that halted speech pattern that he has, that has again become iconic with the portrayal of Dracula. Now, Todd Browning is probably best known for Dracula and another film that came out in 1932 that's called Freaks. You may or may not have heard of Freaks. It was a pre-code film that was banned because it was considered to be too graphic. It basically cast real circus, quote, freaks, unquote, in the roles of the freaks in the film. It very much is a film about moral justice, and it very much is a film about difference of ability and disability. That said, I've included a link to a picture from the film Freaks. Before the days of streaming, you really couldn't find it anywhere. It was very difficult to get a copy of it. I remember how happy I was when I was able to get a VHS copy. It goes to show how old that was. Now you can find Freaks, of course, because of the internet, if you so wanted to see it. But the film that we are focusing on, because it is considered to be the first American horror film, is Dracula. So, I've included a link from RU Video that I think you should be able to access. If you can't, let me know. And Dracula is the film loosely based on the Gothic novel that was written in the 1800s by Bram Stoker. So it has many of the conventions of the Gothic that we established earlier, the haunted castle, for instance, the dark passageways, the mystery that needs to be solved, the damsel in distress, the possibility of supernatural elements. Though I can say that the book is very different than the film version. The film definitely collapses the text because the film is only about an hour and 15 minutes long. So there's a lot more in terms of the text. It also tends to collapse characters as well. I think of them almost like two different stories, to be quite honest with you. And some of the things to look at while you are watching this film, note Dracula's image, especially at the points where he's wearing this large medallion, which has oftentimes been likened to the Star of David. And the reason why that's important is because of possible anti-Semitic messages within the film, that Dracula is foreigner because he's non-Christian, and therefore he's portrayed as evil. You might notice as you are watching the film an armadillo. There's no real reason for this armadillo being there outside of the fact that Todd Browning, the director, liked armadillos. So obviously it makes sense to have bats and rats and things of that nature. This film was subject to censorship, so Dracula's death groans were thought to be too graphic because they could be viewed as sexual. And Dracula and the vampire myth is often associated with sexuality. So initially that was omitted. Expect to see these large, majestic Gothic sets, lots of Christian imagery, and the idea that Christianity is savior, a message that we will see over and over again over the course of the semester. You will definitely see this sense of victim and victimizer that we oftentimes see in the Gothic. Now, film code at the time had indicated that the monster, the alien being, and note that in Latin, monster means to show or reveal. And I think that all of these, quote, monsters, unquote, that we will be seeing in horror films show or reveal things about us, that the true monsters are ultimately humanity. But the film code at the time indicated that the monster needed to be destroyed at the end, which is something that we do see in Dracula. If you're familiar with the 1930s Universal film movement, then you know that there were other films at the time, such as Frankenstein, where they had to destroy the monster in the end, even though in the text, the creature didn't necessarily he didn't necessarily suffer the repercussions of destructions. Without too many spoilers here, so I guess I'm warning you, there's a spoiler about Frankenstein here, so you might just want to cover your ears. That in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, at the very ending, the creature decides that it's going to commit suicide, but we never see that suicide occur, so there is the possibility of a sequel. So you can uncover your ears now if you were covering your ears. So some of the themes that you're going to be finding with Frankenstein, or I'm sorry, with Dracula. And again, some of you might want to watch Dracula first and then come to this video again at minute 14:30. Here we are, minute 14:30. Think about Dracula as a blood-sucking capitalist, symbolic figure, especially in the 1930s. Certainly, Dracula comes from aristocracy and a certain wealth and privilege, and the idea that he's preying on the masses. That would have been a message that would have resonated with audiences in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Also, think about Dracula as evil foreigner, a kind of reverse imperialism, if you will, so that ultimately what we have is the foreigner from Romania invading England and Europe and corrupting its women. And perhaps that's one of the biggest fears ultimately of interracial marriage, is that there will be a mixing of traits. Think about again the prevalence of eugenics during this time period. Um, Sexuality has always probably been associated with the vampire. The idea of penetration is not too much of a stretch to think about the vampire's bite as a metaphor for sexual penetration. And note that a vampire is killed with a stake also through penetration. And even if you've never seen Dracula before, you probably are familiar with all of the folklore associated with Dracula. That's how iconic the vampire myth has become. And I can tell you that many of those elements were first included in Bram Stoker's novel and again borrowed by film, so now they've become part of popular culture. The corruption of the female, as I had suggested earlier, Dracula's victims are almost always women. The idea of life versus death, and what happens at death, and what if death is not the end, and what if life can be postponed? It's a perhaps question that goes all the way back to the idea of what is perhaps the most inspiring, fearful thing in our lives. Whether it's H.P. Lovecraft stating the unknown, or whether it's Stephen King's literally facing death, the greatest unknown is indeed death. The past invading the present. This is something that we saw in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, for instance, when we talked about this mystic Caligari. Again, we have narrative embedded within narrative, and we can't necessarily trust the integrity of our narrator, but certainly you'll see the idea of the long lineage of the vampire and the history of the vampire invading present day Europe. It is more prevalent in the novel. Again, the novel is much more sophisticated in some ways than the film. Not surprising, that's oftentimes the case. Christianity, and this is something we'll see in even contemporary horror film, that Christianity is usually presented as savior, and anything that's considered non-Christian is considered as evil or other, which gets to the idea of this class, that which is other, whether it's because of race or gender or ethnicity or sexual orientation, or in this instance, religion, that's considered to be a threat and oftentimes is portrayed as evil and monstrosity that needs to be defeated in horror film, which is one of the ways that horror film can be read from an allegorical perspective. And I do talk about films being read much in the same way that literature is read. So I always suggest 3 viewings of the film. You may or may not necessarily be able to do that. The first viewing purely for plot. And as iconic as Dracula is, I'm always surprised at the number of people who have not seen Dracula. So that said, you will have a black and white film again, as you have with Caligari. The technology wasn't there to give us color. In fact, we're going to have to wait several decades before we get to a color horror film. But we will have dialogue. Even though we don't have a soundtrack, we do have dialogue. And I think it lends to the eerie atmosphere because you can focus on special effect sounds, and there's a sense of eerie silence sometimes that goes on. Any of you who've ever seen A Quiet Place, then, and I recommend that horror film, then you understand the fear that could be associated with complete silence or with the possibility of noise or music. The sense of the animalistic nature of humanity is something that we will see throughout this semester, certainly personified by something like the vampire. A myth that has existed since the 1700s in New England, of course, New England being the New England, from Puritans settling this area. Tuberculosis would have been running rampant during that time period, which oftentimes mimicked many of the symptoms that are oftentimes associated with vampirism: very pale skin, weakness, and the idea of a premature burial was not unusual during this time period, so much so that individuals could be buried with a death bell or burial bell, which would be a bell that would have a rope attached to a toe, let's say, or a wrist. And that rope would go through the soil up until it reached the surface, and the bell would be there so that if somebody had been buried prematurely, they could ring the bell and notify individuals. So this sense of rising from the grave, though of course the idea symbolically of the past rising up and attacking you, there is no way to escape the past, is also a wonderful metaphor to consider when we're going through horror film. So, as I had indicated, that this film is considered to be culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant by the Library of Congress U.S. National Film Registry. In fact, many of the horror films that we will be viewing in this class have the same designation. But this would be the first, because this is considered to be the first American horror film. So today's attendance question is my asking you, after watching Dracula, if you watch it the first time for plot, the second time, if you have the opportunity to do so, you can watch it for analysis. And then the third time would be just to refresh your memory before you are perhaps going to respond to the attendance question, or perhaps before you're going to write a journal, or Dracula might be the film that you might want to devote a final project to. Do you agree or disagree with that assessment that Dracula is culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant? And why? That's your attendance question, but as you know, the journals are much more open-ended. They're basically your thoughts and responses to Dracula. And then next class, we'll talk a little bit more about Dracula, and we'll move forward and we'll talk about a film that's much less iconic, but I would argue equally significant. And this film represents the 1940s. Note that I've basically divided up the class to have films represent each decade. So the 1920s, represented by The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. There are lots of other lenses through which we could view that film, but it seems like the film is very much a reflection of its time period and its place. And I would argue the same with the 1930s and Dracula and all of the subsequent films and their time. So that seemed to be a good way to organize the class. So I hope you enjoy watching Dracula. And certainly as we move into October, it seems like a wonderful film to be watching in terms of atmosphere and mood, especially now that our weather tends to be changing as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with Dracula. And of course, cat people. Take care. Bye-bye.